Tonight on KQED Newsroom, House Democrats begin drafting articles of impeachment against President Trump, setting the stage for a showdown with Republicans on Capitol Hill. Also, don't let a spark turn into a flame. We'll talk through the best tactics for diffusing family holiday tension. And the Nancy Pelosi way, from building bridges to tearing down walls. A new book describes the leadership style of a political powerhouse. Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Marisa Lagos. We begin tonight with the week's top political news. On Thursday, Speaker Nancy Pelosi said the House of Representatives would begin drafting articles of impeachment against President Trump. A day earlier, 4 constitutional law scholars testified before the House Judiciary Committee. 3 of the experts testified that the president had committed impeachable offenses in pressuring a foreign power to open an investigation into a political rival. Also this week, California Senator Kamala Harris announced she was dropping out of the presidential race. Harris had gotten off to a strong start with an impressive performance at the first Democratic presidential debate held in June. But since then, her campaign was marred by infighting and muddled messaging on key issues such as health care. With us now is LA Times political reporter Melanie Mason. She joins us via Skype from Los Angeles. Thanks for being here, Melanie.
Thanks for having me.
And joining us in studio, Politico senior writer Carla Marinucci. Carla, thanks to you as well.
Good to be here.
So, Carla, I want to start with you. It has been a big week in the impeachment inquiry, a lot of news. We know Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced just yesterday that she has directed the House committees to actually draft these articles of impeachment. Can you just quickly walk us through what happens now?
Well, now we've got the House Judiciary Committee is going to take up these articles of impeachment. We may hear from President Trump, from some lawyers with regard to the House Intelligence Committee starting on Monday. There is an issue with a federal judge and subpoenas up on Tuesday. But I think the big news is today the Trump administration basically said the president's not going to participate in this.
So, which is what we've seen all along, a lot of attacks on the process, but not any eagerness to actually join the process.
Absolutely.
Do you think that this decision weakens or strengthens Trump's hand in this whole thing?
You know, I think like everything about this impeachment process, it's going to be seen through a partisan lens, Marisa. I mean, the Republicans are going to cheer Trump on and say this is a phony process and a witch hunt. The Democrats are going to say, there he goes again, complaining about a process, but not trying to participate in it. So I think we're back where we started, and this is still going to get more and more dramatic. We'll see if the House will be able to wrap this up by Christmas, which is what they want. But who knows how this is going to go?
I mean, I want to turn to the presidential race soon, but before we get there, you've covered Nancy Pelosi for a long time. She really has become the driver of this process. Absolutely. I mean, so much control, and she really resisted it until the Ukraine scandal broke. What political calculations do you think the speaker's made in the last few weeks?
I think at this point, as you said, she was very careful in the beginning, talking about how this was going to affect her members, particularly in purple districts, how divisive it was going to be for the country. That Ukraine, the whistleblower and the Ukraine revelations changed everything for her. As she said this week, this is about the Constitution. It is not about the election anymore. It is about protecting congressional rights of oversight, and it's also about issues like obstruction of justice. And we're going to see how far these impeachment, the impeachment articles go.
Right.
Are they going to include obstruction of justice, corruption, and maybe the Russia investigation? So we'll see how that goes. But boy, Pelosi is now the driver.
She is. All right, I want to bring Melanie in here. Melanie, we know that support for impeachment is really split among party lines, and the country is very split on this. I'm curious, as somebody who's been covering the 2020 race and is out in districts around the nation, how do you think this is playing, for the presidential candidates, but also for congressional Democrats who might be defending their seats against Republican attacks, essentially?
I think to take the congressional question first, I think Carla's point about this being seen through partisan lens is really a true one. And so what we've seen is that polling hasn't really changed people's opinion very much, even as we saw all of these hearings being done in the Judiciary Committee and in the House Intelligence Committee before that. So I do think we have seen some outside groups coming in, particularly to the aid of President Trump, and I think trying to scare off some of these House Democrats, particularly if they are in some of these more purple districts. But it doesn't seem like so far anybody's been really loosening loosening in their resolve. I think on the other side of the ledger, on the presidential race, there's a real practical implication here, which is that if the House decides to impeach the president and it moves over to the Senate, there could be an impeachment trial happening right in the middle of the height of the primary season. And so we have a number of candidates who are senators who may not be able to be on the trail on the lead up to some of these key contests because they have to be in Washington, D.C. for an impeachment trial. And so if you're Senator Elizabeth Warren or Senator Bernie Sanders or Senator Amy Klobuchar, you're probably looking at this and saying, does my January look substantially different than I thought it would a couple months ago?
A lot of flights. Well, one senator who doesn't have to make that calculation is Kamala Harris from California. Melanie, she dropped out of the race. You have been covering her since she launched this campaign in January. What went wrong? It started off so promising for Kamala Harris.
I think that those expectations that were set from the very beginning, I mean, this really sort of dazzling launch rally in Oakland, really strong first debate performance against Joe Biden, set expectations that would have been high for any politician to hit, and particularly somebody like Kamala Harris, who I think had a lot of the sort of raw attributes that should make a strong politician. But the truth is that a lot of times it never quite clicked into gear. And I think that for those of us, all of us have covered her in California before she was a presidential candidate. I think we saw some of the tendencies that maybe hampered her career and sometimes in California really playing out in the presidential race. And I think particularly sometimes this instinct for caution, maybe sometimes second guessing her instincts, that really led to a muddled message that I think made it hard for her to make a single core pitch about why her in this very crowded presidential field. And so I think a lot of people generally liked Kamala Harris. I think that she made a good impression on Democratic primary voters. But when you have so many candidates to choose from and so many who I think had a very clear justification for winning or for running, she couldn't offer a counter argument that I think swayed enough people.
Carla, I want to bring you in here too. I mean, this was a race where you had Kamala Harris's sister, Maya Harris, co-chairing the campaign. A lot of upheaval, as Melanie mentioned, within that campaign, but also these questions of sort of who Kamala Harris is. I mean, as someone who's covered her for so long, what do you think was sort of the biggest challenge here?
You know, I think she learned that running a presidential campaign is a whole different thing from running a statewide campaign. I've never seen a campaign that was so focused on a circular firing squad. She had internal divisions going on in that campaign that didn't help her, and then her messaging was an issue. She didn't seem to know where she was when it came to major issues like Medicare for all. She came out of the box talking about how strong she was as a prosecutor. Kamala Harris for the people, that was her motto. And yet when she took fire from progressive Democrats about that role and scrutiny about that role, she seemed to back away from it. Trying to please everyone, as Mel said, sometimes too cautious, all of those things came together, and the coverage, I think, reflected that.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, we saw Julian Castro, another candidate of color, really lash out at the media, including Politico this week, saying that Kamala Harris was essentially held to a different standard because she was a woman of color. I kind of wonder if she held herself to a different standard because she knew how hard she's known how hard it is to run, and maybe that caution. I mean, but what do you make of that attack?
You know, I think what Mel said, remember when she came out of the box, she got some very glowing coverage all over the country. She did have, there were some hurdles, and I have to say she took some heat that other candidates didn't take. Say with her relationship with Willie Brown. There were a lot of trolls out there on the internet. There was a lot of negative coverage on that. That's not the kind of coverage that a lot of male candidates get about their dating history. And I think on that, yeah, there may be an issue. But with regard to like how her campaign fell down, the issues, the internal debates, I think we were straightforward in the coverage on that. The LA Times, other media organizations looked at this campaign in a critical and I think fair way.
And you're running for president. I mean, you're going to have some tough questions. Melanie, I want to come back to you. The LA Times released a poll this week with UC Berkeley, essentially saying that the Democratic race in California is still very fluid. It did show Warren losing some support, Bernie Sanders now in first place, Pete Buttigieg really doubling his support over the last poll, Biden still in the mid-teens. What is it going to take for something to happen in this race and somebody to break out? It just feels like it's so up in the air still, so late.
I mean, by my count, Bernie Sanders is the fourth person to now lead in a statewide California primary poll, which just goes to show. I mean, the leaderboard really is. It's like we're trading off. And I think to the point of what's it going to take, I think there's a couple of factors here. The first is, as much as we have been following this obsessively for the last year, it is still early. People have not started voting yet. I really think that there will be a tune-in factor after the first of the year. And I think for Californians, we keep reminding voters all the time, hey, our primary is earlier this time around. We actually can make our voices heard earlier than in 2016. I think you might get people maybe firming up a little bit more of their preferences there. And I think the other factor is when campaigns really start to flex muscle here in the state. Various campaigns have different sort of levels of infrastructure. Sanders has 80 paid staff in the state. I mean, he really has banked on California as being crucial to his strategy. Joe Biden doesn't have any paid staff based in the state at all, even though there are staff that are focusing on California. And so I think that you see that discrepancy. And then there's the question of those who are coming and taking to the airwaves. We all know that California, TV is king when it comes to political campaigns. We've already seen Tom Steyer out on the airwaves, and then Michael Bloomberg, the former New York mayor. He has the resources to blink at the state with ads, and that's exactly what he's doing. And I think our poll captured the very beginning of that, but I don't think that we have fully yet seen what the impact of this deluge of ads will be.
Of course, that poll did not show a lot of love for Michael Bloomberg in this state, but we'll see. Like you said, we have time yet, and people are just beginning to watch. Melanie Mason from the LA Times, Carla Minucci of Politico, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is the most powerful woman in America. In January, she became Speaker a second time after Democrats flipped control of the House and set a record number of women to Congress. In recent weeks, Nancy Pelosi has championed House Democrats' impeachment investigation of President Trump and made a case for it to a skeptical public. A new book by her daughter Christine describes the political and negotiating skills that have made Speaker Pelosi such a formidable leader. Joining me now is author and chair of the California Democratic Party Women's Caucus, Christine Pelosi. Christine, thanks so much for coming in.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So this book is really aimed at giving young women the tools to become leaders. One chapter is entitled Claim Your Seat at the Table. Mm-hmm. And you talk about how when your mom arrived in Washington in the late 80s, that basically she was asked to give a list of priorities to the male congressmen and told to sort of step aside. How does she react to that? And what do you take from how she sort of handled that kind of thing?
Well, when Nancy Pelosi first was elected to Congress, there were 12 Democratic women and 11 Republican women in the entire 435-member Congress. So imagine that 23 women in a field of 435. So she and Barbara Boxer were two of the 12. And they were, they became very close friends and allies. And they quickly realized when they would have conversations with men, and they would never ask their opinion, even one night when the men were talking about childbirth, they thought, well, surely you're going to ask us now. And they still didn't. And they thought, we need more. We need more women at the table. We need more people of color at the table. And now with Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, there are 90 Democratic women, only 15 Republican women, so they've got some work to do. But the idea being that not only do you claim your seat at the table, but you bring other people with you. And in Nancy Pelosi's Congress, you're not only at the table, you're at the head of the table with a gavel.
Yeah, seriously. So how does how she sort of handled that and how she's brought in women and a more diverse Democratic caucus track with what she learned earlier in her career, both as a party leader here in San Francisco, but also as a mom?
Well, Nancy and Paul Pelosi raised 5 kids. We were born 6 years apart. So there were a lot of us. It was a lot of logistics. So it was a lot of every day, every night, making sure that we were prepared for school. 4 of us were at Convent of the Sacred Heart for a combined 48 years. So, that meant every night checking our homework, making sure our uniforms were pressed, making sure we had everything prepared for the next day, every morning making sure we had our bus fare for
organizational skills.
Totally. You have to be organized every day. She would say proper preparation prevents poor performance. But it's the same as with it, when you're raising a child, that if you know that every morning they have to be fed and clothed and off to school and prepared, it's the same thing when you're a member of Congress. Congress, you know there's an election season, a transition season, a budget season, and an appropriation season, and you have to be ready for all those things. These are not surprises. They should not be surprises, and that's why she's able to deliver so much for San Francisco, because she knows the rhythm of the Congress and how to get things done.
Well, your book has on the cover a photo of Speaker Pelosi, and the book really opens with the story of that photo, which was this now infamous 2018 White House meeting where the Speaker pushed back at President Trump on camera. Just yesterday, we saw some of that personality on display again in Washington when the Speaker was asked by a reporter if she, quote, hates President Trump. Let's take a look at how she reacted.
Do you hate the president, Madam Speaker? Because
I don't hate anybody. I resent you're using the word hate in a sentence that addresses me. I don't hate anyone. I was raised in a way that is a heart full of love, and always prayed for the president. And I still pray for the president. I pray for the president all the time. So don't mess with me when it comes to words like that.
So Nancy Pelosi saying, I pray for the president, don't mess with me. What was your reaction? And what does that tell you about, or as her daughter, is that somebody like you know well, having, you know, the way she reacted to that?
I would not mess with Nancy Pelosi. I learned the hard way that's not a smart thing to do. But also, Nancy Pelosi was raised in Baltimore, Maryland, in the Little Italy community, St. Leo's Parish. She was raised by nuns. In fact, when she was growing up, she had these brothers that were groomed for politics, and they thought she might be a nun, which would make this conversation impossible.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, she does go to church every Sunday. She is very much a person of faith, a woman of faith, and so for someone to imply that a staunch, devout Catholic like Nancy Pelosi is motivated out of anything other than love was deeply, deeply offensive to her. And that's what you saw yesterday. And that's what we constantly see. You know, we're the city of St. Francis. She constantly, when she is attacked for having San Francisco values, she says, the city of St. Francis, the values of healthcare, the values of peace, the values of community are values that she's very proud to represent. And that we saw some of that yesterday. We all saw a little bit of righteous anger when she puts up that finger, that mom finger, you know, trouble's coming.
So I know you talk to your mom every day, or almost every day, and this is not unusual for her to be attacked. We saw tens of thousands of ads run against her, sometimes by people in her own party in the 2018 cycle. Republicans, the president, often take to Twitter and the airwaves to attack her. How do you think she feels about those attacks? And how does she kind of talk to you guys as growing up about how to deal with criticism?
Well, she's always said, and we talk about this in the Nancy Pelosi way, criticism and effectiveness go hand in hand. When you get out there and you're effective, people are going to criticize you. If you're not effective, they don't care. They just ignore you. Or they take your list and say they'll do it for you rather than empower you to do things yourself. And when she first ran for Congress in San Francisco, she was viciously attacked by some of the other candidates. And she would say, they can't take my children from me, so they can't give me any harm. Now, when you look at the 2018 campaign cycle, 137,000 negative ads, including a handful by Democrats, most by Republicans. What keeps her focused are the 1 in 5 children in America who live in poverty, and the parents of children who were murdered due to gun violence, whose children were taken away from them. And so you can't really look a parent in the eye who has a sick child or who has lost a child and say, well, Trump mean-treated me today, so I can't go work for you.
Of all the skills and lessons that you have learned from your now very famous mother, what would you say is the most valuable on a professional and personal level?
To have your own authentic self. As Nancy Pelosi always says, and we talk about in the book, know and show your why. You have to know your call to service, your purpose. Why are you there? What are you doing? How are you there to help people? And that power only matters if you're using it to help other people. A lot of people have tremendous problems in politics by the hazing, the bullying. I've been very active in fighting sexual harassment in politics because people think that the trappings of power are such that they allow you to lord it over other people. But Nancy Pelosi would tell you that the way to have power isn't to have the trappings of power, but is to constantly give it away by empowering other people and using your power to make progress in the lives of other people.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Christine Pelosi, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We're well into holiday season, a time of year when we gather with friends and family to enjoy good food and good times. But we're not all alike. Family members come in all stripes. So how do we stay connected with those we love despite political or religious differences? Here to help us now is marriage and family therapist Daniel Ellenberg. Daniel, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
So let's start with a look at the problem. You conduct workshops on dealing with difficult conversations. And one of the toughest topics these days, honestly, is politics. How can we have conversations about things like the impeachment inquiry, the Democratic primary, without making it so personal?
It's nearly impossible to not make it personal because of how we're wired as human beings. You know, when you think about just the whole beliefs around that you shouldn't talk about religion or politics, that's been around for many, many, many decades, if not centuries.
Before this most divisive time right now.
Way before, way before. So if you look at how the brain forms, it forms around identity, and people identify with a particular way of being. So there's certain values and visions about, you know, if you're Democratic or you're Republican, which is not to say that there's just two camps. There's a wide panoply there. But people believe that's who they are. And so when you question someone's beliefs about, you believe this? What, like, there's a sense like, what is wrong with you?
Right, like it feels personal.
It is personal.
Yeah.
And so we have to really kind of step away and go, like, instead of saying it's just politics, it's actually very personal. And so that's part of the problem, because people do tend to take things personally. And so when they're questioned about something or they're looked at like, why would you believe something idiotic like that? Then they tend to feel threatened.
Well, that seems like a very sort of, maybe not the best way to frame something.
You think so?
Yeah. Are there better ways to talk about these things? Because inevitably these conversations do come up, even if you try to avoid them.
I've changed my tune about this. I tend to be an outlier in terms of my willingness to bring things up, and I really encourage people to be open and direct. What I've seen in the last 3 years, frankly, has me far more circumspect. My approach right now is like, if you really want to have a great time at your Christmas dinner, there's a high likelihood that talking about politics is not going to lead you there.
What's the strategy for not feeling attacked yourself, not getting defensive if other people aren't taking your advice and are bringing it up? I mean, is there a way that we can sort of check ourselves to think about how we react?
Right. Well, there's two different parts to this. One of them has to do with how you look inside yourself, because basically as human beings, we're wired to either be in a survive state or thrive state. And when you're in survive, which is really what we're talking about, you feel threatened. And when you feel threatened, you tend to become defensive, because
that's something you can feel sometimes.
Absolutely.
Right?
And so if you just tune into yourself about that, you notice that your heart is racing or that your throat has gotten dry. Mm-hmm. You can actually start to speak to yourself and say, it's okay, you're going to get through this. And breathing, as much as we hear like it's good to take long, full breaths, well, actually it is, because that tends to trigger what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, which tends to make us feel more calmer and more connected, rather than being in the fight-flight reaction of the sympathetic nervous system. So, but the other part of it is when somebody kind of blindsides you, like you've come in there.
You're like, we're just going to talk about our kids.
You've got a great plan. I'm not going to go there. Absolutely no way I'm going there. You come in and someone says, gosh, what about that Trump, or what about Pelosi, or what about whoever? Why would you believe something? Like, they come up and they're very confrontational with you. I think it's good to have a plan going in. Mm-hmm. If you've decided you're not going to go there, say like, hey, I want to have a good time. I'm sure you want to have a good time. This is probably not a conversation that's going to lead us into feeling particularly connected. And maybe another time we can talk about this, but probably not around the Christmas table.
With everybody else. I mean, what is it, do you think? Because it's not just politics, right? There are a lot about the holidays that are very stressful for people, getting together with their families, spending extended time. Is it the holidays, or is it just that extended exposure to the people in your life?
Yes.
All of it?
I think it's all of that. If you think about families, they have all kinds of issues and dynamics that have been going on for years, if not decades. And so, like, John and Mary had fights as a kid, and there's a 4-year difference, and John was always critical of Mary. And she's distrustful of him in some way. She doesn't feel safe with him. She doesn't feel like she can really express herself. Right. And he's going to be criticizing or sarcastic with her. So it's not like that suddenly changes because you're sitting at a holiday table. All of those dynamics are there. And some people we naturally know we feel safer with, we feel more connected with. Other people we're far more suspicious about because we have felt threatened by them and felt pain in relation to them.
And you have that trauma. I want to ask too, I feel like when you have kids, the calculation changes around some of those things, like maybe something that you were willing to take from a parent or a relative you don't want to expose your child to. But I also wonder if there's a value to your kids seeing you have difficult conversations and actually coming to resolution. So how do you think about that balance?
There's a huge value to that. But when it comes to having difficult conversations, the most important part is to feel at least relatively safe yourself. And part of that has to do with how curious are you to really understand the other person. If you can really step back and go, how is it that you've come to that position? I really, really want to understand. And it's what my wife and I call the listener-inquirer position, as opposed to the listener-defender position, which is how most people listen.
So to come in with a sort of an open heart and mind, and maybe try to put yourself in someone else's shoes. I want to talk about something like a little more ticky-tacky, which is like actually physically sharing space. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment. My parents were recently in town for an extended period of time, and I love them dearly, but it's hard to figure out a way to get people into, to fit them into your life when it's already so crowded. How do you think about broaching the issue of boundaries, whether they be physical or maybe even like tied to emotional?
So what would be an example? Like, are you saying on some level that your mother is coming into the bathroom when you're in the bathroom, or she's coming too close to you in the kitchen?
Or bringing like too much stuff with her, packing my refrigerator full of things. Literally physically sharing the space can be hard sometimes.
Absolutely. Well, I think the clarity is the beginning of it, and just noticing if something's not quite working for you. And sometimes it's really helpful to have these conversations in advance. So if you want your parents to bring less stuff because it's going to crowd it, probably good to tell them before they pack. And obviously, when you have a relationship with your parents, you have a sense of what their defensive patterns are.
Yeah.
So you can, on some level, say, give them a little crumb. Like, I love you so much, I love you being close, but can you give me a little bit more space right now? The main thing is how kind and compassionate you can be.
Having kids is a very different experience, and I think sometimes relatives have ideas about the way you should raise your children.
Yes.
How do you protect your kids from that kind of thing? Like,
Is it protecting your kids or protecting yourself?
maybe both.
On some level, you are role modeling with your kids. If you can be saying like, we don't speak exactly like that. And of course, every time you step out and you express yourself in a way that's creating a boundary, you're taking a risk. And on some level, it really taps into our willingness to be courageous, because courage is something that is showing up all the time in relationships, and there's always some level of risk when you're setting a boundary. But I've found that the more people actually practice that, and more changes their brains, and over time, shockingly enough, it gets easier.
All right.
Not easy,
but
easier.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Daniel.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That'll do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Marisa Lagos. Thanks for joining us.